Thank you. So welcome everybody. Today's our September 13th Unified Work Program Committee meeting. Got a couple of important things on the agenda we're going to run through. Before I get started though, with regards to meeting logistics, I'm pretty sure most everybody's been here before, but restrooms are out to the left of the front desk. There is a sign-up sheet on a table outside the door, so please make sure you sign up as you're leaving if you didn't sign in coming in. I don't see too many members of the public, but if folks do want to complete a public comment card and provide that, not to Terry Dixon because she's not here, but we'll say to Ryan or Alex, we'll make sure that that we have you on the list for comments later on in the meeting. Since this meeting is being recorded and it's being attended in a hybrid via Zoom, for folks in the room, please hit the button on the microphone before you speak. And for folks on the phone, to help us kind of or on the Zoom meeting to help us kind of identify if you'd like to chime in, say something, make a comment, please use the raise hand function. So with that, we'll start with introductions in the room here. My name's Mike Vanderhoff. I'm Bureau Chief of Planning, Chair of the committee, and representing IDOT. To my right.
Hi, Alex Ensign, CMAP. Was there anything else? I think that's it. Yeah, Alex Ensign, CMAP.
Dave Tomzik, Pace Bus.
Christina Bader, CTA.
Scott Hennings, representing the counties.
Heather Mullins, Regional Transportation Authority.
Buck Doyle with CDOT.
Mike Einhorn, Council of Mayors.
Dustin Clark, alternate for Metro.
Thank you very, very much. And who else do we have in the room?
Brandon Gaber, IDOT.
Todd Schmidt, FHWA. Mike Clemens, Lake County DOT.
Leslie Rower, South Suburban Mayors and Managers.
And Ryan, just to confirm, do we have a quorum here in person?
We do have a quorum.
Okay, perfect. Can you read the list of who is on the Zoom meeting?
We have Emily Drexler, John Hadsma, Kama Dobbs, Mary Weber, Megan Swanson, Noah Harris, and Terry Dixon.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Welcome, and we'll move on to item 2 in the agenda, which is agenda changes and announcements. Does anybody, I guess, do staff have any changes to the agenda first off?
No changes.
Anybody on the committee wish to request a change or add anything to the agenda? Hearing nothing, then we'll move on to approval of the minutes. The package included the minutes from our July 19th, 2023 meeting. Are there any corrections or additions staff or members of the committee would like to identify? Okay, hearing and seeing none. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
And second?
Second.
Thank you very much. Any discussion? Hearing none, we will have a voice vote for those here in the room. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And thanks for the minutes. So one of the big items, we're going to move to new business. One of the big things that is on the agenda today that we wanted to talk about is Unified Work Program methodology that was distributed prior to this meeting. Folks may remember, gosh, it was probably a couple of years ago, we were talking about core program and things like that. And then our budget came around, kind of the last decision-making cycle. And this committee had a little trouble I won't say the committee, but there wasn't a consensus on the schedule that was set up for a number of reasons. Many of them were pretty good reasons. And the action ended up going up to the TC, and as part of that process, there was instruction given to review the committee structure and the purpose of the committees and things like that. And so that has occurred, and I think has been discussed a number of times in this committee. And as part of that process, CMAP staff have developed a little bit more of a guidebook for how this group would function. And that's not only on the core program side, but there's also a proposal out here for how a competitive program would be run, which everybody's pretty interested in, I think. So with that, and since I understand Kama's going to be hanging out for maybe questions later, I'll turn over to Alex to explain sort of the main points of this guidance document.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I'm pinch hitting for Kama today, but she should be available to answer questions online if you have them. So as we promised at the last meeting, we wanted to share a more an updated draft of the core methodology that we've put together with some of your feedback from the last meeting. And then we've proposed a competitive methodology that you should have gotten in your packet and was included in your meeting materials. So for today's discussion, we're just going to review the core program and the few changes that we made based on your feedback. We're going to go over our competitive program proposal, some of the general provisions around active program management, and the next steps for this committee. So as we discussed previously, the UWP is a plan for funding the planning activities and products necessary to ensure the MPO is meeting its federal requirements. So what we proposed is a core program that is for specific ongoing core work to be completed primarily by the staff at CMAP and our partners, with a budget that's based on staff hours and rates, plus any eligible expenses to complete the work that have been outlined in the methodology. So this is really more for ongoing work and not necessarily one-time studies, and more for CMAP or partner staff and not necessarily for consultants, but there's some limited room for consultants within that. And it should really just be a budget that's based on your time and expenses. As we've mentioned previously, the core categories as they're outlined by FHWA are listed here. So we're really trying to make sure that our core work does fall into those categories. So we did make some minor updates to the methodology. Following the last meeting, staff met with the counties to discuss their concerns with the core program proposal. They had mentioned several times during that conversation that the cost to procure data for the types of planning studies the counties typically undertake, and the idea of a more coordinated regional approach to data acquisition would benefit everyone. So as one piece of that coordination, CMAP's going to make every effort to identify the data sets, subscription services, and things like that we plan to purchase that would be available for partner use in the year that we're budgeting for. And then also, if a partner includes data acquisition in their core budget proposal, or even in a competitive application, CMAP staff will look into expanding the scope of that acquisition to see if it would be useful to the whole region. I know we've talked about this a few times at the committee, that the data sharing piece, we know that accessing that data can be really expensive, it could be onerous, so we want to try to maximize whatever data sharing we can do. So as a follow-up from the last meeting, we dug deeper into the history of the PACE Shared Mobility Project. So that was the other piece of feedback from that meeting in July. As described in the current UWP, it didn't seem to fit well with the core MPO responsibilities, but during some digging into historical materials, it became clear that the project is a critical component of the travel demand management strategy of the congestion management process. So it should be an eligible core activity under that category. It did require Kama really digging into some of our paper. So I know that was fun. So those were the updates we made. I think just about everything else is staying the same with the proposed core program methodology. So before I move on to the competitive piece that we're proposing today, I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions from the committee.
Yeah, I had a question. So, the folks who operate our core program activities had a question about the set aside money that was given to that CMAP used last year for the Safe and Complete Streets program, but that will now be programmed for the competitive program. Is CMAP's work in that area changing so that what will now be like a budget hole in that area without that funding source, like that work will just be happening differently or reduced, or will you be taking more money to make up for that into the core program that would potentially like lower the amount available for everyone? Does that question make sense?
I think so.
Sorry.
I do know that so we are, using the Safe and Complete Streets set aside in the competitive program, and we're going to try to make that continuing moving forward. I think on the CMAP side, our work on Safe and Complete Streets, at least for the next several fiscal years, is going to be funded through the state Safe Streets for All grant. So we're going to be working on the county-based safety action plans. So I know that's the big chunk of work that we're doing next year. And then I think the rest of the work that we are doing for the Safe Travel for All roadmap program is just going to be funded through UWP funding.
I think that's like the question that they were trying to understand is like, if there's now kind of a budget hole for that programming from where that set aside money funded it before, now it's just kind of coming out of the pot, the core pot. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. I don't know. I don't know that I can answer your question now because I feel like it'd be better to have someone from the finance team involved in answering. So I don't want to answer off the top of my head. I don't know if Cami, you have any thoughts, but I know we're just beginning our work planning process for FY25, so I don't think we've necessarily made those decisions yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree, Alex, that we don't have a firm answer, but Christina, I think, thinking about how we've always done bicycle pedestrian safety planning, transit access planning, that's always been a part of our work. So I don't want to say we didn't ramp up because of changes to legislation, because we did, but I think we're seeing that even back out and just be a part of our regular operations going forward. So I think that's why kind of taking that 2.5% set aside and directing that towards the competitive helps us to have our partners participate more. It's just a routine part of our work, if that kind of gets at it there.
Kind of. I understand without knowing like what your program is next year, it's hard to answer. So that's helpful, just information to have.
Yeah. And like I said, we could have someone from finance confirm, we could follow up with folks from the CTA, but my understanding is that we could have used UWP funding for that work. Initially, we were using the Safe and Complete Streets set aside. We could go back to using just general UWP funding for that work without it necessarily creating a hole. But we could definitely follow up and get back to you on that.
Alex, do you by chance know if there's overlap with the SS4A program and the grant that's funded by USDOT?
I didn't hear the first part of that question. What was the question again?
There's the SS4A Safe Streets for All grant that CMAP was awarded. Is some of that work shifting from being funded by UWP to that USDOT grant?
My understanding is that the SS4A grant is really specifically for those countywide safety action plans. There will be other work taking place through that program, STAR, that, in addition to the safety action plans. I don't think they're not the same kind of large scale projects. They'll be smaller projects, but we do have work under STAR that should be slated for FY25 that would just be funded through UWP.
So that I understand the way this is written in the memorandum, you're looking for safe and accessible options. And at some point, you're going to be judging one plan or one project against another based upon safety. Is that true?
Are you on page 10 under competitive program? Okay. Okay, I've got a draft. So once I printed a copy, I don't usually reprint. So we're not looking at the exact same thing.
It just says for MPOs to spend at least 2.5% of their federal metropolitan planning funds on activities to increase safe and accessible options for multiple travel modes. And I mean, I would have think that safe and accessible are like the cornerstones of our operation. I'm not sure. I would hope we're not pitting one project against another based upon safety. Kama, you got a comment on that?
Yeah, no, we're definitely not. Part of the 2.5%, that's a directive from the IIJA that MPO shall spend 2.5% of their metro planning funds on this list of activities, which is in Appendix B of the attachment. Those are things that we do. It's access to transit. It's planning for bicyclists, pedestrians, planning safety projects. So remember too that we're talking only about planning funding here, not about implementation funding. So, I think that at the risk of I don't know, sounding like I'm blowing off the federal requirement, we do safe and complete streets planning in almost every planning activity. All of us, everybody sitting around the table. And so I think that demonstrating that we're spending 2.5% for those activities is not a big thing to do. It's not a hard thing to do.
So I would say it's not necessarily so much pitting projects against each other, but when we talk about the competitive program, I mean, there's a competitive element to the fact that we'll be scoring projects, but we'll be scoring them based on various criteria. So we want projects to be demonstrating a commitment to safe and complete streets. But as Kama said, I mean, that's a general consensus among all our projects that we're always going to be prioritizing safety and accessibility.
Yeah, I there could be a little bit of a issue with the messaging. So this 2.5% requirement goes into place, and it affects primarily MPOs that are doing nothing or not much with regards to safety. In Illinois, we looked at 2.5%, and this isn't a precise number, but we're thinking, well, we're probably doing 20 or 30% in each of the MPOs. And so this 2.5% really it's a requirement that doesn't change most operations. And I think the way I read this is because CMAP is actually doing 20, 30, 40, with all the different work they're doing is hitting that federal requirement 2, 3, 4, 10 times over, that that allotment of money could probably be used somewhere else because the commitment has been met.
Okay. Can I ask another question about this?
Absolutely.
Okay. I guess on the next page, because I'm kind of new to this, although I've been involved with the CMAP folks and going all the way back to CATS for a long time, but not at this level. When I look at the criteria, I read some of these, and I'm not sure that I understand. I don't like ambiguity, and in the criteria, the third one down, it says influences or implements statewide planning efforts. Can you explain to me what that statewide planning effort looks like so I understand?
Do you want to run through the competitive program explanation first? Because I think some of the questions we're getting are about core, and some of them are about competitive. So maybe, Alex, if you run through competitive, then that may or may not answer your question, but we can then have the conversation about competitive.
The only reason I say this is because if these line items could be expanded a little bit with a little more explanation, it would be more meaningful to me. And I'm going to give you the ones I kind of highlighted was that one about the statewide planning efforts, past performance of what or whom, which because I don't know who that refers to, project administration, who is that, regional cooperation and efficiency between who and whom, and then emerging issues. I don't know what an emerging issue is. And, you know, somebody could throw anything in there that's going to affect the outcome. And in the paragraph below, it talks about funds available or shifting regional priorities. Who gets to shift regional priorities? Who's the person that does that? And then there's a typo 2 lines below that, just so you know. I'm trying to understand exactly what's going on here. And I don't mean to be argumentative or disagreeable, but when I read stuff, I just have to understand what we're talking about.
No, thank you for those questions. So I can run through the competitive program. I just want to make sure are there any more questions about the core program before I continue?
Yeah, I got a question. I was hoping you could just expand a little bit on something. So when we're talking about a methodology here, we're talking kind of the nuts and bolts of how something is done, you know, and with the core program in particular, there is a ton of language dedicated to the specific activities, you know, who does what, you know, and how it's related to everybody. But there's scant information about how the funds will actually be distributed, or what's the plan, like is any sort of expectation about year-on-year changes. You know, like obviously it's how we've been doing it now. We get a pool of money and then we kind of like parse it out between ourselves, typically based on the previous year's, you know, programs, which is kind of like the crux of the matter of it sort of being ad hoc. You know, can we expect, I know this is just a draft, there's more work, plenty more work to be done, more feedback to be gathered. But is that a gap in the information that's going to be filled, you know, and expanded upon later? Just again, how are we going to decide how the funds are distributed? You know, when do we find out how many funds are available? Because I know sometimes it's a belt tightening year, so we'll ask for a little bit less. Sometimes we have surprise, we got some more, you know, of extra funds. And this question is in light of kind of creating some sort of shortish term, you know, of course, in planning terms, it's a couple of years, you know, sense of structure and expectation.
I don't know if you want to tackle this first and then I could piggyback at Gamma.
Sure. I think the expectation is for the activities that are listed as core activities there, eligible activities for partners to submit. The expectation is that you would submit your budget to fulfill those activities, and CMAP staff is going to look at our own budget and your submitted budgets and, you know, hopefully fund everything unless we've gone like crazy wild with what we think it takes us to complete our requirements. But I mean, these are the required activities, so we need to fund them. You know, beyond that, I mean, we'll, you know, at least $1 million is going to be set aside for the competitive program, but it's a pure math exercise. Tell us what your budget is, and we're going to do everything we can to accommodate it.
So to clarify, those activities that you would be working on under the core program, TIP, congestion management plan, these are basically Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the long range plan. These are identified in law and regulation, and they're not likely to change. And so unless there's a major change in what a single agency might be contributing to one of these, it should be pretty similar activities year to year. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so every agency here is going to contribute to the TIP every year. You know, just like CMAP's work ramps up for the long range plan in some years and ramps down in other years, I'd expect our partners to ramp up and down with us, right? But other than that, you know, ramping up and down of what activities are going on in a particular year, I think we all will stay pretty steady with our core.
And that'll stay the same until we get a new highway authorization or there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that would change something. And there should be decent visibility on that, I would think, in advance.
So just I guess if I were to clarify or rather synthesize that, the answer is we're gonna just kind of keep doing what we're doing year on year with the core, you know, and there isn't gonna be a more defined or codified formula or methodology. Just what are your numbers, our numbers, and we're gonna try and make it work.
Correct. Yeah, it is. The core is not a competitive thing. These are the activities that we need to do to meet our requirements, and we need to get those covered in our budget.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's just, because obviously there are going to be more qualified activities to be funded than actual funds, so I was wondering what the black box is, on your guys' end to see what's waiting, what's worthwhile, I mean, and then of course we figure it out on our ends collectively with our own organizations as well. But thank you. I appreciate the information.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that, because as I was looking through here reviewing, I was wondering if the partners do have a pretty good handle on what the level of detail, if we agree with what's stated here under partner activities. And where's UWP attending UWP meetings?
I guess we should add that in there.
I looked for it, but I may have missed it. Anyway, sorry.
No.
Were there any other questions about core?
Hey, Dave Tomzik, PACE. First, Cam, I want to thank you for digging through the old archives and probably digging through boxes and everything to find some history on the rideshare program. So it goes way back. So it was good that we caught that up. Second question on the data is, I guess my question is, how is that all in this process that how would others know what data is needed on someone's activity? Let's say, because it says that there's issues of potentially sharing it, or if it's for regional purposes. I guess where in the process is that going to be part of? Would that be something up front, or while after projects come in? Because that could affect also the cost of a project if there's some ability to maybe two projects don't need purchasing the same data set or something. So just, has that been thought out, or is that something to figure out later?
Dave, I really think it's going to be ongoing coordination, right? I mean, we've been hearing, throughout our discussions that, I think you would like to have streetlight data and somebody else is fine with replica and somebody else uses something else. And, one of the things that we heard in our conversation with the counties is how half the cost of a long range plan is procuring, streetlight data for the county for a very small window of time, and they would like to continue that. Well, if it turns out that everybody in the region would like to use streetlight data, why isn't the MPO purchasing the streetlight data for everybody? Instead of us paying 300,000 here and 200,000 here and 500,000 there, it seems like if we could coordinate these purchases, it would save us all money in the long run. So, it's going to take us some time to ramp that up. We do have a new data sciences program lead position at CMAP, and as that program ramps up, I think we'll see that regional coordination become more routine. For now, we're going to have to do what we can to talk among ourselves here with this committee to try and do the best we can while that program gets wound up to coordinate. But it's definitely, we shouldn't be all procuring the same thing separately. If we can procure it at once and save money, that's the right thing to do.
From IDOT's perspective, pretty much every time we buy data now, we try to get rights to share it with everybody in the state, at least agency wise. And so I think the notion, what I read here is, if say you're going to buy some traveler survey data or something like that, if you're going to buy it and it's going to cost an extra 10% or 20% to get data sharing capabilities on that data, go ahead and do it. So I would like every agency that's purchasing data to be thinking about the option to share data with other agencies, just because we're all spending so much money on it. But anyway, that's the way I read this, and whether CMAP's doing a procurement or it's an individual agency, I think buying the ability to share data in that purchase is pretty valuable.
Yeah, I think like up front, the logistics is we just have to work it out and try to figure out. So okay.
Can I ask Kama another question? When I read the core metropolitan planning activities, under the CMAP activities, do we do any design planning with maintenance in mind? Because I honestly, a maintenance of what we have out there is really a concern for me, because we design all kinds of really neat stuff, but then when you go down the road 5 or 10 years and go, gee whiz, how do I take care of this? There's nobody around to answer that question. So I think that somehow that needs to be woven into this. And then the same thing would hold true for the congestion management process. I think that there ought to be at least a sentence or something notated in here that there's going to be an objective analysis of a project once it's been completed. So, we do a project and then nobody goes back to see if it really turned out to be as good as we thought it was going to be, or did we make errors that we should have learned from for the next project. I don't know whether anybody does that, or do we just kind of walk away and figure, oh, that one's done, and we move on to the next thing. So those would be my suggestions in this long document. And then the last thing I got a comment about is, unfortunately, an IDOT issue. There's some time frames listed in here about certain things that IDOT's got to do in certain time frames, like on page 17, it talks about it. And IDOT is not the most timely operation in the world, from what I can tell. So, what happens if we don't get cooperation to the point where we need it in order to be able to meet our own requirements? And what do you do then? We talk about completing stuff within a year, and if IDOT's involved and they don't get back to you, what do you do? That's all.
So thank you. Okay. So I hope that staff captured the comments about planning with implementation and maintenance in mind, and also performance measure of implemented projects. And so those are kind of comments that we can capture. You had an earlier comment on a competitive program, sort of one of the criteria, and then we got to schedule.
Yep.
So are there any other comments on the core? We have one more. We're parking lotting those just for a moment, and then we'll get going.
So not a question, more of a comment. When the first iteration of this was released and discussed, the counties did have some serious concerns about the changes proposed to the core program. I just want to say thank you to Alex, to Kama, to the rest of the CMAP staff for working with the counties, listening to our concerns and revising the draft accordingly. I feel like what's in front of us today is a good compromise. I think something that the counties can get behind, and I just want to say thank you.
If I could, I'll second that. We had some initial considerations on I think the draft that we had about 2 years ago. This current draft that we have in front of us, this is in a much better position from our perspective. And I think it actually does a good job of outlining exactly what the core requirements are supposed to be, which in my short time on the committee has not been this clear up to this point. So thank you for outlining this nicely.
Thank you for that. It's good to hear good feedback. I just wanted to speak to Buck's comment from earlier before I move on with the competitive presentation, because I think Cam actually captured really well what we're trying to do, and unfortunately it's a work in progress, so I can't say we'll have a perfect process for data sharing or a perfect process for putting together the core budget over the next year. But I think what we would like to get to is something more like a formula program for the core. It's just, we don't want to give arbitrary percentages to anyone, because we know that we'd like to see the budgets you want to build first and try to work together from that. So one way that we're going to try to get closer to something like a formula program for the core requirements is through, in a big way, just having better templates and better detail in terms of like what kind of budgets you're putting together. So we're going to try to put together better templates for that. which we'll put out before we put out the, request for core proposals. So we will be updating those templates. We'll try to get the detail we need to try to put together a budget in a more transparent manner so that it's not that black box that you mentioned. We don't want to do a black box anymore. We want to try to do it collaboratively and transparently.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I also very much understand how, especially when we're kind of talking with a legacy program like this, it's a matter of kind of building out more qualitative detail first, before establishing some concrete, well, just so that, like you said, the quantitative measures, the formula that's eventually down the road will actually be founded in something. So I very much understand that. Thank you, Alex.
All right. So moving on to the competitive program recommendations. So, we had some discussions about what a competitive program could look like at the last meeting. So this is the proposal that we've put together. We're definitely open to some discussion about this. And Kama will, I'm sure, be excited to answer a lot more questions. But just to give an overview of kind of what we outlined in the document. For the competitive program, these are the general parameters we've worked out. So as we mentioned, it's going to be at least $1 million annually. It's going to include that 2.5% of the Safe and Complete Streets set aside with an additional pot of money, probably something between $400,000 and $500,000, something maybe a little bit over $1 million. It really depends on what we get from IDOT and IIJA, any other emerging funding sources that we find out about. So we're going to commit to at least $1 million annually. It might be actually a little bit more than that this year. And we'll be split up into those two buckets. The eligible agencies who can apply for the competitive funding will include RTA, the service boards, counties as a single county or as a group, municipalities, either as one municipality or if you want to apply jointly as a group of municipalities, or a CDOT. And then the project types will include planning studies, and those can be in-house or consultants. So I think we're going to move away from saying all of the studies have to be done by consultants for the competitive program. We're going to allow a little bit more flexibility there. And then, data, software, planning tools, one-time purchases. As we mentioned, also, these projects must result in deliverables. We wanted to give some parameters to the size of the project so we can be sure, we're not only awarding one project per year or awarding 50 projects per year that we can't even track. So we're, for the moment, proposing that they be between 75 and 750,000. They should be projects that you can complete in one fiscal year and be fully scoped. Recognizing that the one fiscal year is really challenging for projects. We'll get into a little bit more detail about that and we can answer some questions, but the idea is that as we build out a 5-year program, we'll be able to have more of a horizon for these 1-year projects. And we're proposing a few different ways to help with the procurement piece so that the projects can be completed on time. So these are the criteria and weights that we're proposing for scoring these projects. We propose that each project could receive up to 45 possible points through this methodology. Several of these were discussed in July, but some of them are new. So I'm just going to run through each of them in a little bit more detail to hopefully address some of Mayor Einhorn's questions or any other questions, but then we can go into more detail if needed if any of these are still unclear. So the first one is that the project advances CMAP's strategic direction. This is a little bit of a shift from saying the project advances on to 2050. So last year, CMAP published, or was it last year or earlier this year? It was earlier this year because it feels like what is time post-COVID. So earlier this year, CMAP published a strategic direction. It's a 5-year strategic plan that basically kind of hones in on some of the priorities of on to 2050 so that we can think a little bit more about what to accomplish in the short term to get to what we need in the long term with on to 2050. So it focuses in 3 areas: transportation, regional economic competitiveness, and climate. And then the transportation focus area, we'd like to award points to competitive projects that advance any of the objectives in this focus area. So those include systematized and strategic transportation funding investments, modern and efficiently maintained transportation system, and improved travel safety.
So the list you've got the categories on page 11, and then following the categories sort of by each criteria is defined, and it shows how each criteria is scored.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. So we have some detail in the methodology document, but we can go into more detail if needed. The second piece is around the federal planning factors that were mentioned previously. So these are factors identified specifically in a federal law to be addressed by MPOs. 1 point would be awarded for each factor, up to 6 points. If a project doesn't address any federal factors, it will not be considered for UWP competitive funding because it needs to address at least one of these. So every project would be 1 to 6. Did you have a question, Scott?
Just real quick, as I looked through the packet, I just noticed on the packet it says max of 4 points for this category, and on the slide it says 6. So it probably just a typo on one or the other, but just drawing attention to that.
Yeah, it's supposed to be 6.
It's supposed to be 6. God, I see it at the same time you're seeing it.
Thank you.
Yep.
I know one of us should have caught that. This is we did intend for it to be 6. These are critically important for the projects. As we mentioned, they each have to address at least one of these planning factors. The next criterion is whether it influences or implements statewide planning efforts. So, just as we want our work to support regional priorities, federal priorities, we also want to address statewide priorities. So this would be another criterion that, can add up to a maximum of 6 points. So this includes a lot of existing statewide plans like, the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, Carbon Reduction Plan, Public Transportation Plan, these sorts of items. So we want to make sure that you're aligning, with the strategic direction on to 2050, any statewide plans, and any federal planning factors. The next one is whether the deliverables or outcomes would be used by others. So we talked about this a little bit in the July meeting, and this was something that sounded really exciting that other MPOs were doing that had basically a competitive program with this kind of methodology. Is they gave priority to projects that were able to be used by multiple partner agencies. So that's why we'd love to see competitive projects that are, combined from several counties or several municipalities or several, partner agencies, so that we can try to get, more sharing, more data sharing, more deliverable sharing, so that we're investing our money more wisely. The next one is around past performance. So this one will be a little bit tricky as we're starting up the program. We anticipate this will work a little bit more smoothly several years into the program, but the idea is that we can award points based on the percentage of projects that the agency has funded for the applicant in the last 5 years that were completed within the programmed fiscal year. And the second piece is the percent of funds that were expended, or percent of awarded funds that were expended. We recognize that, the points are not going to be high in this section now, but I think as we get into the competitive program running over several years, we'll be able to, incorporate this more clearly in the methodology.
So if you're a new applicant, you'd get 0.
Yeah, right now I don't think
that's how. And if you've been in the program, you've had other projects, would be based on whatever your percentage is.
Yeah, I think we can look at how projects have been funded in the UWP in the past 5 years. And even though we didn't have this methodology then, but I think we don't want to apply too much weight to this criteria at all at the moment. The other piece that we know is that, the counties have been rotating funding amongst each other. So we don't necessarily have a county program over the last 5 years that could be compared for the past performance. So for that, we're actually going to propose, I think we can give folks points in this area, but we recognize it'll need to improve over time. And then for the counties, what we could do is say we award 4 points or just some sort of nominal amount for counties that don't have a past performance from 5 years ago. Or if we can find them, we'll dig into those older records and see if there's something in a box somewhere.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So, we've probably all or developed a program and scoring criteria, and you start scoring projects and you figure out some of the criteria worked great, some of the criteria didn't work at all. Is this something that's going to be set for a while, or I guess would you all entertain, adapting the criteria because you figure out, these didn't work, let's try these other ones, and maybe doing an annual sort of refresher. We're getting ready to do the program. These are the criteria we did last time. Let's keep them the same because it works great, or we propose tweaking them a little bit. Do you envision like that kind of thing happening?
Yeah, Mike, I think like we do with the CMAC and TAP program, the STP Shared Fund program, if we get on to this every other year cycle of issuing a call for projects, and then in the interim year, you look at lessons learned from the last cycle and tweak as in a response to those lessons learned with enough time to set everybody up for the next call. So you do call, analyze and tweak, call, analyze and tweak, call, analyze and tweak. And so that allows us to just improve upon the system as we go. So yeah, there could be criteria here that just don't work at all and they will get abandoned. And there will be criteria here that work great, but for one little tweak. So, and there may be criteria completely missing that we want to add later for some reason. So it's definitely the intent to do lessons learned every time.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, or even potentially a suggestion, depending on how you receive it. Given that for the specific measure, there's likely to be or potentially a lack of a track record, specifically pertaining to projects that were funded by UWP, is it feasible on your guys' end to, at least for some sort of initial period, be open to considering related projects that align with whatever policy objective you're shooting for that wasn't funded by UWP? Just something to think about, because there could be a lot of these ongoing projects that are certainly related and could help build the case that you're trying to make within the scoring. That just could be the same thing, maybe scale varies or whatever, depending on the organization. But if this is meant to try and build a quantitative sense of a track record, using your funds, and so on and so forth, then perhaps that's something that might be worth looking into.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I think that we've got the SPR program that is similar. And we also have the non-UWP funded planning projects that are included in the appendix of the UWP that would be appropriate maybe to fold into this formula. So we can look into that for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
This is just a clarification. When you're describing projects completed within the program fiscal year, is that the original fiscal year proposal, or is that like if projects have been granted extensions and they ultimately completed on time from the extension?
Yeah, I think we would have to consider if an extension was granted, that changes your due date, right?
Okay. Great.
And if a project, we've done multi-year projects in the past, so we would have to consider that period as being on time, right?
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
So on this topic, I'm wondering if this criteria, we just pause until we have 5 years of data to look at, because otherwise you're comparing projects' performance under a different set of rules. Because in the past, you didn't have to complete a project within the programmed FY, so I'm not really sure how you would use past data to determine past performance. What's the metric that you would use when we had 5-year contracts to complete projects?
I'm not sure I cut all of that, Heather, but I think we have to start somewhere. Building that 5 years worth of data. To judge you just on one past year doesn't seem fair. So looking back and again, it's very much stated here thinking about how it would fit into this program if this program were implemented. But as has just been mentioned, there are kind of some weird mitigating circumstances, so to speak, on how the program's been run in the past. And so we'll have to adjust for that in the calculation until we have 5 clean years of single fiscal year requirements. So we can add some language in here that would say, for the initial 5 years, it will be this combination. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think my issue is just that the data you have is under a different set of rules that you would be comparing it to. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So our next criteria is under project administration. Since we've had extensive discussion about the role of procurement in delaying projects, we opted to give projects that don't require procurement because they're staff-led projects a highest score of 4 points. Projects that don't need new procurement would receive 2 points. And then projects that have a complete RFP package that's ready to release and is ready for governing board approval would receive 1 point. So you could receive 0 to 4 points for under the project administration. The next one is for regional cooperation and efficiency. So you would receive 0 or 4 points here. Projects that would utilize any of these methods that are listed to increase regional cooperation and efficiency would receive 4 points. And then the last two criteria would include awarding 2 points to projects that are a continuation of a past project, and then a criterion for emerging issues. So for this last criterion, committee members would be asked to rank all project applications except their own based on any factors that aren't included in other criteria and or new or changing priorities in the region. And then the ranks would be averaged, with the highest ranking project receiving 3 points, second highest 2 points, and the third highest 1 point. We realize the emerging issues sounds kind of vague, but we actually left it that way on purpose so that kind of by design, this committee would have a little bit more agency. If there's a project that we think seems really important and addresses something that we all know is, something very topical and critical for the region, but it's not necessarily something that was outlined in On to 2050 or even the On to 2050 update, we could award it some points under this emerging issues category. And then moving on to program development, as Kama mentioned, this would be a program where we would do a call for projects every other year until we establish a 5-year program. And that would include a contingency program. So basically we would include this program so that we can draw from a bench of projects as necessary to fill gaps if other projects are delayed or fall behind, and could be adjusted in between calls if needed. So we would do a call for projects, then we would do eligibility determination and scoring, and then put together a staff recommendation, which would be discussed by the UWP committee. There'd be a period for public comment, and then this committee would approve the final program, and then it would move on to the transportation committee and final approval by the MPO policy committee. So that's the presentation. I don't know if there are a lot of other questions. Ready to continue discussing the core or competitive program. And I can also move back to any slides if you want to look at those.
I have a question regarding the administration about having the RFP ready to go. But how would you know what the funding is? I submit for 500,000. My RFP is based on an ICE of 500,000, and it determined I'll get 400, then that RFP might have to be redone. So how is that making that any ready available? Because we don't know what the funding level is at that point when because this is all going to be done with the application, right? The review of our project readiness, but we don't know what the funding set is. So the RFP can't be developed. You see what I mean? I mean, you could come back and we could have $100,000 less, and it could be a different scope or different activity to make it fit, or maybe the project. So I guess you're giving credit for having work done, which you don't know is going to be able to move forward.
Yes, you are essentially, Dave. The idea is, and the terminology having a ready to go RFP is meant to say, do you have a full scope? Do you have a budget that matches the funding that you've asked for? If we told you tomorrow that you got the money that you asked for, could you go take it to your board and execute it? If we came to you tomorrow and told you you're only getting half the money you asked for, naturally you would have to revise that RFP. But the idea is to be rewarded for being ready to go should you be awarded the funding that you've asked for. And yes, there's an understanding that there's some staff work that goes into putting together an RFP that may be wasted time at that point. That's the balancing act of being ready to accept funds and that you're asking for. So
that process would have to be taken consideration of the whole application and the time committed to putting together. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, partially, Dave, I suspect some of us have very nearly ready to go RFPs, just sitting and waiting for somebody to give us funding to execute them. So hopefully we're not putting too big of a burden here at application time.
Any other questions on the?
I have a quick question on it. For having the complete RFP package, are you asking us to submit that as part of the application or just check a box that we have that ready to go?
I think we would like to see the scope as part of it, right? I don't want to say I don't trust you because that's not true. I definitely trust everybody sitting at this table to check that box and be honest about it. I think it'll be similar to how we conduct our other calls for projects. I don't want you to have to attach 300 pieces of paper that we're frankly not going to read, that we're just going to say, yep, here it is. So we'll figure out the right balance either in the application package. And if you've got a suggestion for what that right balance is, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, I think the scope is fine. I don't know that we could provide the RFP package because I think there's issues with procurement rules on making that public before it actually is released.
So to clarify, when you're talking about RFP package, you're talking about the full set that you would need in your organization to submit and actually start a procurement. I think that the way I read this is, and I think what Cam was kind of mentioning is having the scope of work for this laid out well enough that you could drop that into your package and it would be good enough to go. And I think that to me, this is more of a first programming year issue, because say they do a 2 or 3 year program, it's the ones that find out, okay, you're getting money next Tuesday, you need to be ready to go. But then after that, you've got, it's going to be July 1st, 2025 that you need to be, getting your procurement completed hopefully by then so that you could start billing right after that. That's kind of the way I read it. I don't know, Cam, if that's right or wrong.
Yep, that's the intent, Mike. You got it.
Yeah, I had a question about the procurement processes that are lined out in this document. So specifically the option 2 where sponsor is procurement agency. I don't know if this is part of something you're going to talk about later, but.
Yeah, we're going to go in a little bit more into the active program management provisions.
I can hold.
Yeah, this is mostly if we wanted to ask any more questions about these criteria and what we've laid out in terms of
I will hold.
whether these are the right criteria, the right scoring, the right weighting. And then I can move on to the last part of the presentation. Were there any other questions about the criteria themselves?
Less question and more kind of a comment on what we were talking about before, which I think was a really hairy issue, which is kind of the administrative burden associated with drafting a proposal, right? Someone mentioned, sometimes some people have the, scopes and kind of the whole thing ready to go, ship it out. That's not the case for a lot of, a lot of organizations. And, it's a serious calculation for some groups to have to weigh, okay, is it worth it to actually even set aside the staff hours, to draft a proposal, and we still have no idea, if they would get it or not. Maybe perhaps internally, this is again something about the incrementally improving of the processes, that you establish some sort of benchmark or goal saying, okay, we wouldn't want our proposal to take more than 15 work hours, so to speak, or something, and that's also something that have to be learned over time, getting a sense of how long it took each agency to actually draft a proposal. And that's a good question to ask them. Hey, did it take you 20 staff hours? Did you have someone who knew this really well and then it happened smoothly? Or did you have someone that was doing it for the first time and had no clue, so it took way longer? These are just things to consider, and just an objective, okay, we don't want this to take more than 20 staff hours. We internally here at CMAP think that'd be too much of an administrative burden or something along those lines, because for every organization, it's different and that's very complicated, and we don't want to exclude anybody from participating based on their lack of resources ultimately.
For sure.
Yeah, I think we could definitely, we could discuss that and see what we could come up with. That's a good suggestion. Any other questions about criteria?
I didn't see anything in the selection committee or criteria related to equity, and that just seems like an area that perhaps we should try to include in here. Maybe it's based on where the project is going to be executed or who the applicant is. I don't know how to address that, but that does seem like something that's missing from here.
Yeah, on that note, there are the USDOT Justice 40 census tracts. Perhaps that's the easiest geography to pull out. Does your project impact one of these census tracts? If so, you get some points.
I think, Heather, part of why we left it out is that UWP planning projects tend to be more regional in nature and not location specific. And I think that the emerging issues topic, those points for the ranks there, may be a place where an equity lens could be applied. Staff couldn't wrap our heads around any way to judge a planning project on equity. If you're talking about phase one for an implementation, that's easy to do because it is location based. But most of these most of the planning work done through the UWP is at an agency-wide level or a county-wide level or region-wide level. And so how does equity figure into that? So I think we couldn't wrap our heads around it enough to propose something. And that's why we don't see it.
Yeah, I would say we did discuss it, and I actually oversee our equity programs at CMAP, so it's always kind of at top of my mind, but it really kind of speaks to what Kama was saying, because these are regional or sub-regional studies. I didn't quite see how equity would fit into them, but we do have equity scoring criteria in the active program. So, in STP, CMAC, TAPLink, we have equity as a scoring criteria there. So when you get to implementation, that is part of the criteria. But if you have suggestions for how we could incorporate equity, we could think about the Justice 40 piece and see if there's somewhere we could weight that.
I have one more question regarding with the deliverable outcomes. Is there any, which I might have missed it, of that the work leads to further development of a program within that agency? For example, we had a UWP project for our bus rapid transit program, which was developed the program which led to each refinement of those corridors. So I guess, was there be any credit for giving it to a piece of work that would lead to further refinement of a program in that agency? Because it mentioned about other agencies, but what about continuation of an existing, like a program within an agency?
I don't know, Dave. I think thinking about, what's the deliverable there, which may be a toolkit or a program, right? A best practice. I mean, those things can be a deliverable. But I think it's, again, the intent with the scoring is to elevate projects that provide deliverables that can be used by many. So, if that best practice or toolkit or whatever can be applied, maybe not one for one, but can certainly be used as guidance for some other agency for a similar program. I think that would make sense. I think if that deliverable is benefiting just the one agency, it probably doesn't get the points here as proposed. If there should be another level of score under that criteria, I think if you want to propose that, we can talk about including that in that criteria.
Isn't that a continuation of past projects in Dave's example?
It could be, yeah.
So that would get 2 points. According to page 11. Another example, Metro sustainability plan, if we do additional task orders or future task order request, would be scored with 2 points.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can see how it could be tailed to that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dave. That was a good point.
Are there any other questions before we move on to program management?
All right. So thank you. These are all great suggestions. So I think we'll be able to take this feedback and hopefully improve these scoring criteria some more. So just going into some more of the details of the active program management piece. This would actually apply to both the core and the competitive pieces of the program. So just you consider that they apply to everything. So starting first with the general provisions for consultant or contractor activities. So the methodology draft, it proposes 2 options for procurement of consultant services. CMAP could lead the procurement or the sponsor of the project could lead the procurement. So under either option, the methodology requires that both CMAP and the sponsor designate project managers and that those managers participate actively in the procurement and implementation of the project. The provisions also call for the entire procurement process to be accounted for in the project schedule. And I'll have an example of how a project will work under these provisions towards the end of this presentation so that we can kind of talk through how it would play out. The second piece is data purchases and sharing. So as we mentioned, we do want to require that any data purchases or any software purchases that are purchased with these federal planning funds be shared with CMAP. And they also call for increased coordination through our new data science program lead, or generally with the research analysis and programming division prior to making purchases, so that consideration can be given to expanding the scope of the purchase to meet the needs of others in the region. So this gets at what Mike said about, if you're already purchasing some data, can we increase the budget for purchasing that data by 10 or 20% so that it can be shared with all of our partners? The next piece is for status updates. So these aren't really new to this program. Everyone's already been giving these quarterly status updates. But the methodology documents the dates the reports are due and notes that the failure to submit updates could be the cause for removal from the program or denial of future funding requests. So we are going to rely on these for those scoring criteria in future years of the program to look at your past project performance. So for projects in the out years of the new multi-year program and those that are in the contingency program, The requirement would be just for semi-annual reports in October and April. So, we recognize your project hasn't started yet, but we do want you to submit a report twice a year saying, we know our project is coming up. We have a project manager slated for it. We want to make sure that you're still thinking about this project and knowing that it's coming up in the next fiscal year. The next piece for active program management is under reprogramming. As we review these reports and we make these considerations, we will look at whether funded work hasn't started within the first quarter of the fiscal year or within 1 quarter of when it was scheduled to begin, and if it was a project expected to take less than a full year to complete. If this happens, funding will be forfeited and reprogrammed first to additional core activities, but then second to out-year competitive projects that are able to get started early, and then last to contingency projects that are able to get started within the next quarter. So the status updates will be used, they won't just be cataloged by CMAP and never looked at again. They will be used to identify projects that could utilize reprogrammed funds. So we really want to get to a place where we can be spending all of this funding in a timely manner and having that contingency built of projects that we could slate in if others get delayed. So under the methodology, there's the notion that projects must be completed within a single fiscal year, since that is how the funding is allotted to the region. The policies within the active program management section state clearly that all funds must be expended or they will expire. Through the quarterly reporting process, staff will monitor expenditures, and at the end of the 3rd quarter, if it appears that any core funding may expire, that funding may be reallocated to another project or projects and extended 6 months for those projects. If funds cannot be successfully reallocated, they will revert to IDOT for use statewide.
That slide says may, so we change that to will, please.
Sure.
That was kind of a joke. Metropolitan planning funds, if they're not used, if they're not used as they're programmed, after consultation with metropolitan planning organizations, the state can repurpose Metro PL funds for other planning purposes. I think that's probably what that's referring to, but I don't know that we've done it. In fact, we're working right now with all the MPOs to try to figure out a way to get at balances that have built up over time. So that's, we don't want that last provision to actually happen, because it's just we're taking a shovel and we're moving the pile, and it's just throwing stuff right back on the pile that we're trying to work down anyway, which is behind some of the program management. I think that's probably in here. So anyway.
Let's see. So next up, we have the deadline extensions. So project sponsors will have an opportunity each spring to request a deadline extension of 6 months. Extensions won't be considered if there has been no project activity. In order for an extension to be given, there must be a reasonable expectation that the project will be completed within the extension period. Extensions will always be contingent on IDOT allowing the contract extensions. So you'll have to put in the request in the spring. We'll have to confirm that with IDOT, and if IDOT concurs and grants the request, then it can be extended by 6 months. But we won't consider the request if no work has begun on the project in the fiscal year. So because I found this all very confusing when I was trying to figure out how to give this presentation, I thought it'd be helpful to put up an example. I know this might be a little bit hard to read, but I tried to put together kind of an example competitive project timeline. So starting from this year, say we have project X, it gets proposed during the call for projects, it gets programmed for in the UWP through this cycle right now, but it gets programmed in an out year. So it's, you estimate you can start the project in FY26. It's been approved by the various committees by March of next year. The fiscal year starts in July of 2024, And because you have a little bit of a longer runway for when you know the project is going to get its funding, you know that you can start your procurement for the project in September of 2024. You can send us a status report in October, let us know that the procurement's been initiated. You can have your, say, 9 months to get the procurement completed. And then you can prepare your project to kick off in April of 2025, provide another status report. And then in July of 2025, at the start of the fiscal year, you've got your procurement in place. It's been approved by your governing board. You can go ahead and kick off the project and then provide quarterly status reports, and then your final deliverable in July of 2026. And then if you did, for example, need a 6-month extension, what you would need to do is in April of 2026, you would need to put in that request with your status report. That would need to be approved by CMAP and approved by IDOT. It would mean that you have to have had some project activity completed between July 2025 and April 2026. If it gets approved, your project get a 6-month extension. So that's it for the active program management piece. I don't know if there are any further questions about that.
Yeah, just one question about the deadlines for the quarterly reports. I know at least our agency's financials for that previous quarter aren't available till the 25th of the following month. And it looked like your deadlines were like 2 weeks after the end of the quarter.
It was an arbitrary date, so yeah, we can make it work.
So yeah, if maybe you could add a couple weeks to that.
Okay.
Yeah, good suggestion.
So if I have a question, if CMAP's willing to do the procurement and they're going to assign a project manager, could a committee agency submit an application for CMAP to do a planning project for them or on their behalf?
I don't see why not.
Thank you. Is IDOT able to apply?
Well, Mike, if you want to apply for CMAP to provide, say, phase 1 and phase 2 engineering agreement review services, I think the region would be behind that.
We'll put that one in the hopper. The mayor supports that one already.
Yeah, I just want to say about the schedule for starting the projects and kind of the having it done within the federal fiscal year, I think is overly constraining for applicants. I think it's really difficult to get your timing to work exactly to start on that July 1 and get it to end by July 1 and then back up to get your procurement done so that you don't have too much time after you've completed the procurement from when you start the project, because I don't know a consultant that wants to sit around for 6 months and not start the project once they've been awarded. I mean, it all seems just very difficult to actually logistically get everything to line up to work out perfectly. And then just the time frame for 12 months to complete a project is difficult. I think the 6-month extension, I think, is useful. And I think almost everyone will be asking for an extension during that time period. So I think that's helpful. I guess I just don't really understand the reasoning behind the 1 year when we've had multiple years in the past to complete these projects. Why we're going from, I think it was 3, or I don't remember what it was, I think 3, to now this very strict 12-month with maybe a 6-month extension.
I think some of it is what Mike alluded to earlier. There's been this buildup of unused funding throughout the state. Federal funds don't last forever. And if we don't try and hold ourselves to higher standards, we never will hit those standards. You know, is 1 year too tough? We may find that it is, Heather. And, you know, if we institute this and nobody makes it, then we know it's too tough. And then we talk about, okay, what's more appropriate? I think that we'd like to give it a try. you know, if we can set that bar high and we can meet it, that positions us to, I don't want to say to take away from the rest of the state, because I mean, we're not that way, but at least to not give back to the rest of the state. So, you know, if you all will bear with us, I think we'd like to try it. And again, if everybody fails, then we know we set the bar too high and we can make adjustments there.
I guess on that, in that line though, I mean, the stakes are a little bit high. I mean, if we don't complete the project in this new timeline, then our grant expires.
Well,
and we're on the hook for the, you know, funding difference.
And you get dinged.
And we get dinged in the scoring next time.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna echo Heather's comment that the 1 year project time frame is just pretty unrealistic for our agency.
I mean, I get the idea. We want to get that pile low. We want to get rid of that pile, but are we setting up the sponsors for failure because of that 1 year? And also going back to the initiation of the project, of how you would scope it, that would you get, is it realistic to begin with? I know we want to spend the money, but if we're going to spend more time coming back for amendments and extensions, that's just delaying the project versus that saying that we have an 18-month prod time or 2 years to get it done, that the system flows better. And you may get better projects that would not even consider it because of this tight deadline. And then then we're just spending the money just to spend the money on projects that ever come up. But if there is the ability to have the extensions, it's there. It's not, the money's not going to disappear at midnight. Why not try to encourage the best projects out there? And this goes back to when you apply and you set up a project and the scope, that's all part of it. And there's delays in the whole process from procurement. I mean, every agency seems to need procurement managers and hiring managers and planners and staff. So we know this is going to continue for the next few years. So I think that we don't want to set up sponsors to fail on projects. So why push it so tight?
And I think a couple of things, Dave. Again, you know, part of it's about setting the bar, right? We need to strive to do better. You know, I think one thing to consider in scoping out projects, we're talking about multi-year programming now. And so a project may continue over 3 years, but it may have 3 distinct budgets, right? For year 1, year 2, year 3. And some of this is going to be dictated by how we can negotiate contracts with IDOT, right? If Mike and Brandon tell us we have more flexibility than we think that we have, then we can work more flexibility in here. But I think that, you know, we've been asked to tighten up, and so we're proposing to tighten up.
But be realistic, I guess, in terms of how the project sponsors be able to deliver the project. And within that 1 year, does that mean everything has to be invoiced within that 1 year, or because that's not realistic? We may get the completed report on the last day, June 30th. Let's, for example, if we file the state fiscal year. So when does all the billing have to be rectified and the contract closed? Because there's after that fact too. And I know, like with some of the existing UWP, there's like a closeout date, but you know, some of our information has to be given to our accounting department earlier, by mid-June, which cuts off the 12 months. We're already less than 12 months. So when you factor all the administration's parts of trying to reach the deadline, you're looking at less time, and I don't know, and it's only $1 million, 1.3 million, which is what, 2 or 3 projects potentially, sometimes, unless you get all these smaller projects that may not be done in a year. So I don't know. I'm maybe just try to you know, not be so tight onto the 1 year, because there seems to be, there's an answer to that. because we want to spend the money. I think everybody wants to do that. We want to get that piled down, but what's the most expeditious way of doing it?
I mean, Mike, would IDOT be amenable to, say, a 15-month time frame instead of a 12-month time frame, with then a 6-month extension or a 3-month extension or 6-month extension? Would that help some if we went to 15 months instead of 12?
Yeah, I think we would be willing to. I mean, so I've asked Brandon and CMAP to talk about how to structure a separate agreement for the competitive program, or how to structure the competitive program within their annual 3C operating agreement. Those are 18 months with kind of a 12-month performance period, then 6 months to finish invoicing. So they're gonna be looking at a few different options, or we're gonna be looking at a few different options. And I think we're open to something like that. The comments about, don't set this up for failure, I think are definitely fair comments. At the same time, when we were kind of reviewing this and discussing it, somebody said, for example, I don't think we've received any invoices from any of the FY21 competitive program projects. And so I think what everybody's trying to figure out is how to make it tough enough to get projects moving without making it so tough that they are set up to fail. Is that 12 months? Is that 15 months? Is it, you set a firm finish date in your contract once you get procurement done and you meet the terms of your contract? I'm not quite sure what the right answer is. But I say, Cam, to your question, yes, we'd be willing to consider 15. Is that another arbitrary number? Maybe. So if there's any better ideas that come up, I think we take them.
Just kind of my 2 cents on this matter is, it's great to set ambitious goals, and especially when there haven't been any before. Yeah, 1 year sounds great, so let's try it, and if we fail, we fail. But I think kind of the sentiment that I'm receiving here is that the benchmark shouldn't just be an abstract 1 year, we think that'll work okay, but it should be grounded in the reality of each individual organization's ability to actually produce within that time. So when we're talking about setting benchmarks, 15 months, maybe, it seems like people need more time, but that's an understanding that would be really valuable for CMAP. Like we had kind of the sister memo about the measures that other MPOs are doing for distributing funding. What about the flip side of understanding what it takes for our members to actually implement and like even just propose these funds, So, I mean, we can keep pushing the deadline 15, no, 20, 24 months, we're speculating at this point, but each kind of individual organization has their own answer about what it will take, so that might be some good information to gather from CMAP.
Or another thing, you could give points to projects that are more timely, that get done in a shorter amount of period. Say it's a 24-month program, but if you can get your project done quicker, you get a little bit extra points somewhere in here. I mean, we've done that with our contracts. That this is the time frame, but if you could deliver earlier, it would look favorable on your review.
Yeah, Dave, I think that is built in a little bit in the past performance criteria, right? And I think, Buck, to your thoughts, part of the reason for going to multi-year programming is to address exactly what you said. So it may take CMAP 6 months to get going, and it may take CDOT 16 months to get going. So, CDOT shouldn't be applying for a project today for 2025. They should be applying for a project for 2026 or 2027, knowing that it takes that long to ramp it up. And so the idea here is actually to try and be as reactive as we can and as flexible as we can to those different timeframes for people by programming things at appropriate time slots instead of trying to get everybody done within the first year. It will take some time to balance that out for sure. And so, I would suspect, similar to, when we rolled out a new STP program, that we'll see smaller projects targeting the first year, things that can roll out quickly, maybe a lot of data purchases for FY25, and the more ambitious projects figuring out a multi-year schedule in the later years. That's what I suspect. I don't know what will actually happen, but that was kind of the thought process that went into, it's not a year from today. It's not a year from when the awards are announced. It's a year from when you're programmed. So thinking about when to request those funds. Don't request funds in FY25 if your process won't allow you to start until FY27. So, that doesn't help us with FY25. I understand that. And I think that, we're setting goals here that, I think I said earlier, if we all fail, then we set the wrong goal. Well, if we all fail, we're not going to take anybody's funding away. We're going to say, we made a bad decision on what that deadline is, and everybody, let's just finish our projects, right? So, setting goals is one thing, but if those goals turn out to be the wrong thing, we have the power to react to that.
So, Cam, when you create an application for this, you could ask, how long is it going to take you to get through procurement? Can you start procurement, a procurement process? I mean, there's some agencies that can't start procurement, I believe, until they actually have an agreement. Are you able to start procurement in parallel with development of agreement? How long does your procurement timeline? What is your procurement timeline normally? What is the duration of your expected duration of your project? I think to Dave's point, it wasn't how good have you done in the past. It was give extra points for things like data purchases that are sort of turnkey versus 24-month, more detailed projects. At least that's what I thought I heard.
Yeah, I mean, it's the length of there's two schedules. There's the setup, the administration getting to procurement and start of the project, and there's the actual length of the project. And Mike, yeah, there are some that could be done quicker, and some that will just by the nature of the project do take time.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that the past performance scoring criteria can definitely transition over time to also include, what Dave's talking about. Like, well, we thought it was going to take 24 months and it only took us 15. So, that's already split into kind of two sub criteria. And so adding a third sub criteria in there, I think will make sense, and that'll give folks something to work towards, right? More of a carrot than some of the sticks that are in here.
So are there any more questions or comments on core or competitive?
Yeah, I haven't.
One final comment on the eligibility. I think we're stating that it'll be open now in the addition to the core membership, but also to all local municipalities within the region. I think that's casting the net a little bit too wide. I'd recommend keeping it to the core members. I saw the chart didn't include councils of mayors, but I think they should also be eligible for the competitive program. I think just opening it to local municipalities is just going to be too large of a net that we're casting there.
And with the council of mayors, you will collect more regional type projects, and they would be more organized because you have the planning liaison to oversee it and coordinate it, and as opposed to, I mean, again, it's only what 1.1 million, 1.3 million. There's not a lot of money to divide up, so you want to have good focused projects and competitive programs.
So Heather, you're not suggesting eliminating municipalities. You're just suggesting that the applicant be a council of mayors. Did I hear that right?
Correct. Yeah, you can take it that way. I don't think an individual municipality should be able to apply, but I think a council of mayors could come in with an application on behalf for multiple municipalities within their jurisdiction.
Okay. If that's, I'm having trouble seeing head nods, but I think if that's the general consensus of the committee, that's an easy tweak to make.
Did you have a question or comment, sir?
Yeah, I was going to place a comment about the competitive program. The way that this recommendation is structured, it will place a big burden on not only the types of projects that committee members could submit, but also on trying to meet that kind of timeline and schedule. There are some projects that Metro had conducted in years past that are best to be conducted at a certain time of the year, say fall. So for those type of projects, ridership counts and such, you really want to have them happen at a certain time of the year, and to have data analysis, billing all wrapped up by the end of that fiscal year would be a challenge for a project such as that. So I would also echo the concerns of the kind of timeline that's laid out in the recommendation here. Going from a 3-year cycle to a 1-year cycle is a pretty rapid shift, and the initial kind of year of this new competitive structure, I think 1 year is quite tight, and something that I don't know that many of the committee members can actually feasibly meet.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? So this item is an action item. So, you know, the committee could choose to put a motion forward to approve. As it's written, they could put a motion forward to maybe approve part of it. It is fairly distinctly divided between core and competitive, or I guess any options thereof. So is there any discussion on that? Or is there a motion? So let's talk briefly about the core program part of this. We really, so the way our MPO agreement process works is we're starting to talk about what we need to do internally to share the marks, we call them, the budgets we're going to be providing for the MPOs. And we usually try to do that around the fall planning conference, a little bit after, but say by November 1st. And when that happens, then budget development, UWP development begins in earnest, and we want, we start asking for stuff around February. So kind of nailing down really both sides of this, but I think in particular the core side is pretty important to us. So I guess if we don't get a motion at all, we're just going to have to table this and move forward. Is there any interest, I would just ask, in approving the core element of this proposed methodology? I'm just looking around. I'll make the motion. The reason I'll make the motion is because I think that CAMA has demonstrated the flexibility.
You use your microphone, Mayor.
I think that Cam, I think you in your group have demonstrated not only now but in the past to be flexible enough that if we run into problems that we can correct those problems. And I don't know that you're ever going to get a perfect document, because this is really pretty complicated, quite frankly. And everybody's talking about their individual circumstances when this is talking about the broad brush. So I guess if it doesn't work out, we always can change it. It's not like it's cast in stone. So I guess that would be the reasoning that I would support moving us forward.
So your motion would be just to approve the program guidance, core and competitive both?
Yes.
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second the motion so we can discuss further. And I don't want to put my colleagues on the spot, but I think it deserves some discussion. So yeah, I'll second that motion.
It's the old paralysis by analysis thing, because that's really where we're kind of at. You know, everybody internalizes stuff. I get that, unfortunately, but you can't just stand still either.
So we have a motion and a second, and I believe discussion has started. So is there any further discussion on the motion and the second to approve the methodology?
In the agenda, there's a discussion of an October meeting if needed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have a question of the timeline. You mentioned CMAP has everything wrapped up pretty much by the end of the year. It sounds like, to get it to IDOT by February. So how does that October meeting come into play, and how would that fit in the schedule if decisions were not made until that meeting?
The way I view it is, if this motion passes, then we don't really have to have an October meeting, because the guidance will start, CMAP will start implementing this. If the motion doesn't pass, we're going to have an October meeting to try to take another shot at it. That's the way I view it.
And then we'd still be okay within the schedule from CMAP side?
I think it would compress our timeline a little bit. What I think would be helpful to us is if, even if we could just approve the core methodology, we could go ahead and put together those templates for the core proposals, put out a call for the core proposals, and then continue to refine the competitive methodology, which we would need to discuss at the October meeting. If we have to go back to the table with both methodologies and refine them in the October meeting, it is going to compress our timeline a lot for those call for proposals. And as you mentioned, I mean, it's an administrative burden putting those together. So we want to try to leave more lead time for you all to be able to put together those proposals and submit them.
Is there any more discussion or clarification?
So perhaps because the bulk of the conversation today is revolved around the competitive program and changes we'd like to see to that competitive program, I was wondering if the mayor would amend his motion to just include solely approving the core program, and we could potentially address the competitive program in October after we see some of the revisions come back from CMAP. I think that's a good approach, and something I would support if the mayor would like to amend his motion.
I can do that.
So the amended motion on the table is to approve the core portion of the methodology and defer the competitive portion of the methodology until CMAP has made revisions, and we would meet again, and it would have to be in the last week of October, on a date and time a little bit TBD. Is there a second?
I will second that motion.
Is there discussion on that?
That sounds reasonable. I can vote for that.
Okay. Well, let's have a vote then. Do you want to read the roll?
Yeah, we can do a voice vote.
Okay, we can do a voice vote. I wasn't sure it was going to be a slam dunker, but we'll do a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Well, the motion passes. So the core element of the methodology has been approved, and we'll have to, I guess the expectation is CMAP, who has listened intently to all the comments they've heard, will maybe make some adjustments to the methodology, share it with the group in advance of an October meeting, and we will finish up the conversation at that point in time. Excellent. Okay, well, we are moving on to committee member updates. Item 5, do any members of the committee wish to provide an update on UWP related projects? Well, I don't know if that's other business or new business, but I would like to, okay, so I kind of want to look at the FY21 project list. I don't know who's on it. I don't know what projects. I don't know how many, how much, whatever. But if there are projects that were awarded in FY21, I think it would be healthy for us to take a look at them and decide whether or not we should have a conversation about them. So, I don't have an update, but I am making maybe that request for a future meeting.
Maybe that comes up in the October meeting, right?
Sure.
See who's on the bad boy list.
Well, yeah, and it could be it might be a good way. There's a lot of things that come up when you're trying to deliver a project. Could be we lost our match, could be our project manager left, it could be new administration, could, the list is like,
The dog ate my homework.
you could unroll and just send it down the hall. So it might be good to be looking at those types of things as part of the conversation. So,
And if that's going to happen, then we should probably ask for an explanation ahead of time so that we don't scratch our head after we get the list and go, well, I guess now we got to ask this person and he'll have to ask that person, and we'll meet in 2 months to come back and really talk about it. So
with that, yeah, I think at this point, the purpose of my request was just look at these and maybe get something very brief, not really put too many people on the spot, but start to ease our way into some of this, some of a pattern of getting into status reporting and talking a little bit about, maybe we ought to wait. Maybe we shouldn't have applied for this one that year. Maybe we should have waited a little bit, that kind of thing. So that was my request. Maybe it was supposed to be there under other business. So we'll move on to other business. Does anybody have anything they'd like to bring to the committee? Well, hearing nothing, we will move on to public comment. I don't believe we've received any written public comment requests. Has anybody on the Zoom meeting raised their hand or submitted a request to make a comment?
We haven't received any public comment.
Okay. Well, then we will move on to next meeting. I think CMAP staff is going to have to be working on setting up a meeting in the last week of October, and then there is a regularly scheduled meeting on November 8th at 1 p.m. Does that sound correct for everybody? And then on here, there's an actual, I think we've already kind of, in a manner of speaking, approved the October meeting. Do staff feel like we need to go through a motion and a vote on an October meeting?
No, I think the action that you took actually specifically stated an October meeting, so you've taken that action already.
Yeah, agreed.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can move on to
quick question. If the October meeting is successful, will we actually have to have a November meeting?
I want to say yes, but CMAP staff, do you have a response to that?
I think the intent of the November meeting at this point would be to try and turn around what we initially think of the core proposals. There may not be enough time to do that now, so let us revisit that.
So you've got budgets and you need to take some action to approve the core budgets you've received?
Yeah, I mean, the intent would have been to show that initial, here's what we think of the budgets that we got, but I'm not sure that gives everybody enough time to get their budget in. So
in response to the mayor's request, though, if we could knock everything out in October, we can keep November 8th on the schedule, but if we can knock everything out in October, I think that would be okay, correct?
Yeah. And we could also consider moving that November meeting to a later date in November or early December, if that made more sense. So we will revisit the whole schedule as we try and schedule October. How's that?
That sounds fair.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody. We will move to adjourn and make sure everybody's signed in. Does anybody have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to adjourn the meeting. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, for the pinch hit.